He sat on a bench, flipping pages in silence. No one disturbed him until a judge walking by noticed the cover. A bronze star, embedded in leather. He approached slowly, looked closer, and suddenly removed his hat, because in the hands of that old man was a story of bravery most only read about. The courthouse steps had become his daily sanctuary, a place where the world moved around him without demanding participation or explanation. He chose the same bench every morning, position where the oak tree provided shade but didn't block his view of the street. His routine was simple: arrive by 8, settle with his book, read until the afternoon heat became unbearable, then return to the silence of his small apartment. Most people passed without noticing him. To them, he was just another fixture of the courthouse landscape, perhaps a retiree with too much time, maybe someone waiting for legal proceedings, possibly just an old man who preferred public spaces to empty rooms. His presence registered in peripheral vision, noted but not examined, acknowledged but not questioned. Today was different, though no one could have predicted why. The book in his weathered hands looked ordinary enough from a distance: worn leather binding, pages yellowed with age and handling. The kind of volume that suggested either sentiment or poverty prevented its replacement. But embedded in the front cover, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle, was something that transformed everything about the quiet reader and his chosen refuge. Welcome to Silent Salute. Before we continue this remarkable story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The morning had started like any other in Judge Richardson's 30-year career. Coffee at 6, review of case files by 7, arrival at the courthouse by 8:30 to begin another day of administrative hearings and minor civil disputes. The walk from the parking garage to his chambers took him past the front steps where early arrivals often waited for the building to open, but he rarely paid attention to the individuals who occupied those spaces. Richardson prided himself on fairness and attention to detail, qualities that had earned him respect among his colleagues and consistent re-election by voters who appreciated judicial competence over political theatrics. He treated everyone who appeared before his bench with equal dignity, whether they were prominent attorneys or self-represented litigants struggling to navigate the legal system. This particular morning, something made him glance toward the steps as he approached the main entrance. Perhaps it was the stillness of the figure on the bench, or the way morning sunlight caught something metallic on the book's cover, or simply the coincidence of timing that brought his attention to details he normally overlooked. Whatever the reason, Judge Richardson found himself slowing his usual brisk pace. The man reading appeared to be in his 70s, with the kind of careful posture that suggested both physical limitation and ingrained discipline. His clothes were clean but worn, practical rather than fashionable, chosen for durability rather than impression. Everything about his appearance suggested modest means and preference for invisibility, the kind of person who had learned to navigate the world without drawing attention or making demands. But there was something about the book that didn't fit the rest of the picture. The leather binding showed quality craftsmanship, and the way the man held it suggested reverence rather than casual reading. As Richardson drew closer, details became clearer, and what he saw made him stop walking entirely. Embedded in the front cover of the book was a bronze star medal, its metal surface catching the morning light like a small beacon. Not a replica or decoration, but an actual military award that had been carefully mounted on the leather binding, transforming what might have been an ordinary volume into something approaching a shrine. Judge Richardson had seen enough bronze stars in his lifetime to recognize the real thing. His father had earned one in Korea, his brother in Vietnam, and his understanding of what the medal represented made him approach the bench with a different kind of attention than he had ever paid to courthouse steps occupants. The closer he came, the more details revealed themselves. The man's bearing, which had seemed merely careful from a distance, now appeared to be the result of military training that decades of civilian life hadn't erased. His attention to his surroundings, while subtle, suggested awareness that went beyond casual observation. Most telling of all, the way he held the book indicated that it wasn't just reading material but something much more personal. Richardson found himself in the unusual position of wanting to approach a stranger, something his judicial training and natural reserve normally prevented. But standing 3 feet away from someone reading a book with a bronze star embedded in its cover, he felt compelled to acknowledge what he was seeing in a way that went beyond polite recognition. The book itself was a memoir, its title barely visible on the spine but clearly important to the man reading it. Pages were marked with small pieces of paper, suggesting multiple readings and careful attention to specific passages. The Bronze Star wasn't the only modification to the volume. Careful examination revealed what appeared to be names written in small print along the margins, not annotations, but something more like a memorial. Judge Richardson cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle the man, but unable to simply walk past without some form of acknowledgement. When the reader looked up, Richardson found himself looking into eyes that carried the kind of depth that comes from seeing too much and remembering everything. The conversation that followed was brief but transformative. Richardson introduced himself, not as a judge, but simply as someone who had noticed the Bronze Star and wanted to express respect for what it represented. The man's response was measured, acknowledging the recognition but offering no details about how the medal had been earned or why it was mounted on a book cover. His name was Thomas Hartley, and the book was a memoir written by his commanding officer about their unit's service in Vietnam. The Bronze Star had been awarded for actions that Hartley described simply as doing what needed to be done, but the way other veterans had talked about that day suggested heroism that went far beyond routine military duty. The medal had been mounted on the book because Hartley wanted to keep both together, the official recognition and the story that explained why it mattered. Reading the memoir was his way of remembering not just his own service but the friends who hadn't made it home, whose names were written in the margins alongside passages that described their courage and sacrifice. Judge Richardson found himself drawn into a conversation that lasted far longer than his usual courthouse arrival routine. Hartley spoke quietly about service and loss, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear war stories, about finding meaning in the years after uniforms were put away for the last time. The Bronze Star represented one day in a long war, but the book represented the ongoing effort to make sense of what that service had meant. What struck Richardson most was Hartley's complete lack of self-promotion or desire for recognition. He hadn't chosen the courthouse steps to display his medal or attract attention to his service. He came there to read because it was quiet, because no one bothered him, because he can spend time with memories without having to explain them to anyone who hadn't been there. The judge realized he was in the presence of exactly the kind of veteran he had read about but rarely encountered. Someone whose service had been significant enough to merit official recognition but who had returned to civilian life without fanfare or expectation of special treatment. The Bronze Star on the book cover wasn't a display of pride but a quiet acknowledgement of something too important to be separated from its context. As their conversation continued, other people began to notice the unusual sight of a judge in animated discussion with a man on the courthouse steps. Court personnel arriving for the day's proceedings found themselves witnesses to something they had never seen before. Judge Richardson, known for his professional reserve and punctual arrival, standing on the steps engaged in deep conversation with someone who clearly wasn't part of the legal profession. The transformation in both men was visible to anyone paying attention. Richardson, normally focused on the business of getting to his chambers and beginning his judicial duties, seemed completely absorbed in what Hartley was telling him. His posture had shifted from the brisk efficiency of a busy professional to the respectful attention of someone receiving information of genuine importance. Hartley, for his part, had undergone an even more dramatic change. The man who had been sitting quietly, seeking anonymity through stillness and silence, was now engaged in animated conversation about experiences he rarely discussed with anyone. The Bronze Star had somehow created a bridge between his private memories and the public recognition of their significance. Other veterans began to take notice as well. The courthouse served a county with a significant veteran population, and Bronze Stars were rare enough that their presence commanded attention from those who understood their meaning. Word began to spread through the morning crowd that someone was sitting on the courthouse steps with a medal that represented genuine heroism rather than routine service. The gathering that formed around Richardson and Hartley was organic and respectful. No one interrupted their conversation, but an increasing number of people found reasons to linger in the area, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand the details. Veterans identified themselves to each other with subtle nods and quiet comments about the medal they could see embedded in the book cover. Judge Richardson realized that his usual morning routine had been completely abandoned, but found himself unwilling to end the conversation despite the court schedule that awaited his attention. Something about Hartley's story demanded the kind of attention that couldn't be rushed or abbreviated. The kind of respect that recognized the difference between casual interaction and genuine encounter with someone whose experiences deserved careful consideration. The Bronze Star, Richardson learned, had been awarded for actions during a firefight that had saved the lives of 12 soldiers, including the commanding officer who had later written the memoir that Hartley carried with him every day. The specific details of that engagement were documented in military records, But Hartley's personal account filled in gaps that official reports couldn't capture: the fear, the split-second decisions, the aftermath that haunted him for decades. What made the story even more remarkable was Hartley's complete absence of self-aggrandizement. He spoke about that day not as personal triumph but as collective effort, crediting his training, his fellow soldiers, and circumstances that had put him in position to act when action was needed. The Bronze Star represented not individual heroism but the kind of team performance that military service at its best could achieve. The memoir, Hartley explained, had been given to him by the commanding officer's widow after the author's death 3 years earlier. She had tracked down surviving members of the unit to distribute copies, believing that the story belonged to all of them rather than just its writer. Hartley had mounted his Bronze Star on the cover because he wanted to keep the medal and the story together, understanding that neither meant much without the other. Reading the book had become Hartley's way of maintaining connection with experiences that had shaped his life but didn't fit easily into civilian conversation. The courthouse steps provided a quiet space where he could spend time with memories that demanded attention but didn't require explanation to passers-by who couldn't understand their significance. Judge Richardson found himself thinking about the hundreds of people who appeared before his bench every year, wondering how many carried stories of service and sacrifice that never emerged in the context of legal proceedings. The discovery of Thomas Hartley made him realize how much he didn't know about the people who moved through his professional world without revealing the experiences that had defined their lives. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Richardson's bailiff, who had come looking for the judge when he failed to appear in chambers at his usual time. The bailiff's expression shifted from concern to curiosity as he observed the scene, his punctual, professional judge standing on the courthouse steps in deep conversation with a man whose book bore what appeared to be a military medal. Richardson's introduction of Thomas Hartley to his bailiff created another moment of recognition and respect. The bailiff, himself a veteran of the Gulf War, immediately understood the significance of the Bronze Star and the rarity of encountering someone who had earned such recognition. His response was automatic and appropriate, a respectful acknowledgement of Hartley's service and an expression of gratitude that went beyond polite courtesy. This second recognition seemed to affect Hartley more than the first. Judge Richardson's attention had been unexpected but could be attributed to professional curiosity or personal interest. The bailiff's response, however, represented acknowledgement from someone who understood military service from personal experience, whose respect was based on shared understanding rather than civilian appreciation. The small group that had formed around them now included court personnel, early arriving attorneys, and several individuals who were either veterans themselves or family members of military personnel. The Bronze Star had become a focal point for a gathering that felt more like ceremony than casual conversation, though no one had planned or organized what was happening. Richardson realized that he needed to address his court responsibilities, but found himself reluctant to simply walk away from a situation that felt significant beyond its immediate circumstances. The discovery of Thomas Hartley and his story seemed to demand some form of recognition that went beyond personal conversation, something that acknowledged the importance of what had been revealed. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Santos, a local physician who served on the county's Veterans Affairs Committee, had been walking to her office when she noticed the gathering on the courthouse steps. Her approach was motivated by professional curiosity about what might be bringing together such a diverse group of people at 8:30 in the morning. When she saw the Bronze Star and heard a brief explanation of the conversation that had drawn everyone together, Dr. Santos made a suggestion that transformed the moment from chance encounter into planned recognition. The county was preparing for Veterans Day observances, and the committee had been seeking authentic stories that went beyond standard patriotic platitudes to recognize actual service and sacrifice. Thomas Hartley's story, she argued, represented exactly the kind of authentic recognition that Veterans Day should celebrate. Not abstract appreciation for military service in general, but specific acknowledgement of individual actions that had made a difference in real situations with real consequences. The Bronze Star and the memoir together told a complete story that could help the community understand what service actually meant. The suggestion that Hartley be invited to participate in the Veterans Day ceremony created a moment of tension that revealed the complexity of his relationship with public recognition. He had spent decades avoiding attention, seeking anonymity, finding comfort in the invisibility that allowed him to carry his memories without having to explain them to people who couldn't understand their weight. But the gathering on the courthouse steps had created something different from the usual demands for veteran visibility. This wasn't about political theater or patriotic performance. It was about genuine recognition from people who understood the significance of what they were acknowledging. The respect being offered felt authentic rather than obligatory, personal rather than institutional. Judge Richardson found himself in the unexpected role of advocate for someone he had met 20 minutes earlier. He understood Hartley's reluctance to seek public attention, but also recognized that the community needed examples of service that went beyond abstract appreciation to actual understanding of what veterans had experienced and accomplished. The compromise that emerged satisfied both Hartley's desire for privacy and the community's need for authentic recognition. Rather than asking him to speak at a large public ceremony, the Veterans Day Committee would organize a smaller gathering where his story could be shared with people who had direct connection to military service, other veterans, military families, and community members who worked with veteran populations. The Bronze Star and the memoir would be displayed as examples of how individual service connected to larger historical narratives, showing how personal sacrifice contributed to collective achievements that extended far beyond individual recognition. Hartley's story would be told not as isolated heroism, but as representative of the kind of service that too often went unacknowledged in civilian society. As the gathering on the courthouse steps began to disperse, people returning to their daily responsibilities and appointments, the transformation in Thomas Hartley was unmistakable. The man who had sought anonymity through careful invisibility was now engaged with a community that had demonstrated genuine appreciation for what his service represented. Judge Richardson's morning had been completely disrupted, his court schedule delayed, his usual professional routine abandoned in favor of something that felt more important than administrative efficiency. The encounter with Hartley had reminded him that the legal system he served was embedded in a larger context of sacrifice and service that too often remained invisible to those who benefited from it. The bailiff accompanied Richardson into the courthouse with a different understanding of the people who moved through their professional environment. The discovery that someone with Hartley's background had been sitting quietly on the courthouse steps every morning for months without anyone recognizing his significance raised questions about how many other stories remained hidden in plain sight. The attorneys and court personnel who had witnessed the morning's events carried those observations into their daily work. Aware that the routine interactions of courthouse business might involve people whose experiences extended far beyond the legal matters that brought them to that place. The Bronze Star had served as a reminder that official recognition was only a small part of what defined people's contributions to their communities. Dr. Santos returned to her medical practice with plans for Veterans Day recognition that would honor authentic service rather than abstract patriotism. The encounter with Thomas Hartley had provided a model for community appreciation that acknowledged specific actions and individual sacrifice rather than generic expressions of support for military service in general. Thomas Hartley remained on the courthouse steps until his usual departure time, but the quality of his solitude had changed. The book with its embedded Bronze Star was no longer a private memorial but a recognized symbol of service that had found appropriate acknowledgement. His daily routine would continue, but without the isolation that had characterized his previous morning readings. The story of the judge who noticed a Bronze Star on a book cover spread through the community with the kind of organic distribution that authentic stories generate. Social media posts, word-of-mouth conversations, and local news coverage brought attention to Thomas Hartley's service and the community's belated recognition of his contributions. But for Hartley himself, the most significant change was simpler and more personal. For the first time in decades, his Bronze Star had been seen and acknowledged by people who understood its meaning, who recognized the difference between routine military service and actions that merited special recognition. The memorial he had created by mounting the medal on his commanding officer's memoir had found an audience that appreciated both the individual achievement and its connection to larger stories of service and sacrifice. The courthouse steps remained his preferred reading location, but they were no longer a refuge from a community that didn't understand what he had experienced. Instead, they had become a place where his service was known and respected, where his presence was valued rather than merely tolerated, where the Bronze Star could rest openly on the book cover without requiring explanation or justification. Sometimes recognition comes through grand ceremonies and public proclamations. Sometimes it comes through the observant eye of a judge who notices something that others have overlooked, through the willingness of community members to acknowledge service when they encounter it, through the simple act of treating authentic heroism with the respect it deserves rather than the indifference it too often receives. Thomas Hartley never sought attention for his Bronze Star or his service. He had learned to carry both quietly, finding meaning in private remembrance rather than public recognition. But when genuine acknowledgement was offered by people who understood what they were recognizing, he discovered that sharing his story enhanced rather than diminished its significance. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet dignity revealed extraordinary experiences that they never sought to publicize? Someone whose true story emerged only through careful attention to details that others might overlook? Tell us in the comments about the hidden heroes you've discovered in everyday places. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.